Good morning. God bless you abundantly on another wonderful Saturday. Remnant adventures in the Word continue. We are working the great man of God, Joseph, in the book of Genesis, which we will get to in a few minutes here. Craig Martindale speaking to you from Southeast Kentucky once again. Thankful to be with you. And it occurred to me a few minutes before we came on that my promise at the 1st of December was that I would teach us through the silly season. And I began to wonder about next Saturday, and I realized, well, the silly season certainly goes through New Year's, as well as all the hangovers around us. I suppose people get drunk on New Year's because they want to forget about the fact that they have the responsibility of another year coming up, maybe. So, with that wonderful logic, I will teach next Saturday live, January the 5th, and we'll see where we are with the Joseph situation. We're keying off of the great phrase in the book of Amos, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, towards the back of the Old Testament. The great scripture from Amos 5 has been our springboard in this category of harvesting in the gloaming. Verse 15, well, let's start in 14. Seek good. Good is that Greek word kalos, K-A-L-O-S. Seek the ideal, the spiritually perfect, the spiritually symmetrical, a perfection that can only come from the true God, is how Bullinger defines it, and I love that. Because of all the so-called good things that the world brags and pounds its breast on, and how benevolent people think they are, and how spiritual they think they are, and wonderful, there's nothing that can touch the true goodness, the best, a spiritual excellence that can only come from the true God. That's that word kalos. Seek the kalos. And only by seeking His Word honestly and lovingly can this occur in the practical experience of our lives. Seek kalos and not poneros. See, in the Greek you've got rhyming words. Great figure of speech, paronomasia, bringing special attention. Seek kalos and not poneros. Poneros, of course, is wickedness that distracts, wickedness that harasses. So as we operate believingly in Him, we live and move kinetically and have our being. In that, the kalos is part of our environment, our spiritual environment. Remember Dr. Wirbel's great line from Lifestyle of a Believer. God is any human's natural environment. Man as he really ought to be. And for us, our promised land is that spiritual environment of alignment and harmony, wherein we walk in standards of spiritual perfection that only can proceed from our Jehovah, our Elohim, energized by the gift into 9 effects produced as the Word, the living, written Word, dwells in us richly. There's a summation of the more abundant life right there. And for us, our promised land is our body and soul and spirit in alignment and harmony with the Father. The body holding the same relationship to our reasoning as our reasoning does to the Spirit. In other words, Spirit is preeminent. Reason is to be governed by Spirit, and our bodies are to be then governed by the Spirit in our reasoning. The body holds the same relationship to the reason, subservient, as reason is subservient to the Spirit. You can see in your mind the diagram of it. God is man's or human's, a true believing human's natural environment. Remember, body, soul, man is simply no better than an animal. And I think you have to look at it this way. Those that refuse the new birth, that endeavor to just live their best life from their body, soul. And just like in the animal kingdom, you can have domesticated animals, body, soul people that are essentially good people, essentially don't turn into stumbling blocks. Maybe every once in a while they're not even aware that they are. But essentially at times even are good to us as the household of the remnant. It's like a nice domesticated animal. But a body, soul, man or woman that's infected and invaded by devil spirit becomes a feral, wild, out of control, unpredictable, may act domesticated, may act like they're doing nice things for us. But like Psalm 55:21 says, war is in their heart, even though on the surface they appear to be so kind and loving. This is a wonderful distinction, I think makes a lot of sense. As Dr. Earl often said, body, soul, man possessed is actually worse than any animal, but it's an apt spiritual metaphor and allegory to compare it to the venal and vicious wild animal, unpredictability of wild animals, of course, multiple examples that we know of. So seek the ideal and not the poneros, the harassing. That purpose you may live Zoe, live life to its fullest, and that includes and dominates the spiritual side. That's our promised land. That's why there's great learning as we read the records of how the Father got his people eventually to what was initially called the land of Canaan, controlled by the unbelieving Canaanites and all those with them, Perizzites, Hittites, all that stuff. Ammonites, Amalekites, Moabites, Edomites, all kinds of ites biting them, pain in their neck, had stolen God's promised land to Israel. And of course Joshua and his people taking it back is one of the great records in the Word, but we're leading to that with these Joseph records. When the famine hits and drives all of Israel into Egypt, because that's where there was sustenance. The great phrase in Genesis, there was corn in Egypt. There was sustenance in Egypt. And God had worked his great man of God, Joseph, into a position of authority where he was number 2 under the Pharaoh, who was one of those body-soul men who had enough good sense and common sense to see the caliber and quality of a man like Joseph. He couldn't have been a venal, possessed Pharaoh like many were after him, vicious and mean and barbaric and carrying out the work of the adversary to try to stomp out the bloodline of that Christ would lead to Christ. We tried to stomp out the nation of Israel so that they no longer could even seek the promised land. So we learn a lot. They're for our learning. But for us, there's no physical promised land like with Israel in our world today, except where you live right now, where you have claimed for the Father. You've taken root where you believe Father wants you living. That's your promised land physically, and he will bless and prosper those around in it and with you. And as Galatians 6:10 says, be good unto all, especially to the household of faith, which is the remnant of the household today. And so the Lord, Jehovah, the Elohim of hosts, of armies, shall be with you. That means his armies are with us. As you have spoken, hate the poneros and love the kalos. So you've got a great alternation here. Kalos, poneros, poneros, kalos. Look at the structure of the admonition. Repeats it in reverse order. That's a figure of speech in the symmetry and syntax of the language. Hate the poneros and love the kalos. And establish judgment in the gate. Judgment, discerning, proper decisions. The gate was where controversies were resolved, where business deals were resolved, where arguments between families or between people was settled by the genuine men of God that were responsible to rule. But as we read last week, verse 16 or verse 10 tells us, they hate him that rebuketh in the gate, and they abhor him that speaketh uprightly. That's how devilish the environment had become, many ways, as our day and time in which we live. But here again, hate the harassing, the distracting, anything that distracts and harasses you from the Word and God first in our lives. We're to be cold and indifferent to. That's the word hate. Just turn away from it. Ignore it. Don't give it the time of day or the people that propound it. Establish discernment in the gate. It may be. And I explained that this is the subjunctive case in Greek. It can imply doubt. It may be, can imply doubt. It can imply a wish. It may be, I wish that. Or the one I think it really hits the bullseye here is it implies potentiality. It may be. The potential is there that Jehovah Elohim of the armies, of the host, will be gracious unto the remnant of Joseph. Now, it will be flows consistently with the subjunctive, because if it was absolute, it would be the word shall. But it's will, meaning, again, potential, but it's based on the conditions. Conditions of what? Those that seek the ideal and not the harassing, that Zoe live the life of God day by day. Those that hate the poneros are cold and indifferent to it and love the ideal and seek to establish discernment in the decision-making of their lives. Now, that potential can be realized. It will be, the Lord God will be gracious, but it's all conditional. It's not unconditional, like you've heard me harp on many times over these years. There's no such thing as unconditional love. That's a big Christian lie. To absolve people from the responsibility of obedience, from the responsibilities of discipline, from the responsibilities of loving God properly according to His Word, worshiping Him spiritually via the truth. Conditions must be fulfilled. You see, the spirits that inhabit their brains, they just read over all those ifs. They read over all the conditions and just get to the love part. Well, God loves me no matter what I do, what I think, who I hang with, what I worship. He just loves me. That's a damnable lie, and it blinds people to death. He loves those that love Him. Boy, oh boy, they just can't get that in their heads, can they? They think unconditional love. The census world talks about that all the time. That makes it even a double lie. Those dumbbells couldn't even come close to that kind of life. I don't want that kind of life. It's not available. It's a fantasy. It's a pipe dream. It's a hallucination. It contradicts the whole Word of God from Genesis to Revelation. I don't want His love to me to be unconditional. I want it to be all-encompassing because I obey Him. I want Him to do exceeding abundantly above all I can ask or think. Now, that's love, but I need to do the asking and the thinking according to His Word, delighting ourselves in Him, and He shall bring His will to pass. That reminded me back in our early days of this remnant, back around 2013, when we had like 6 or 7 of us. The way we did our telephone teachings then, I called each couple or each individual up and personally taught them the teaching of the week. One of the remnant reminded me of that recently. I particularly remember one I did on the 9 occurrences of delight in Psalm 119. Called up Brian and Deb Barton, called up Bruce and Valerie Altman, called up my mom, called up Deanne Price in West Virginia. I think maybe my brother might have been in on that too, one of my brothers, maybe both, and just taught them individually on the phone the 9 occurrences of delight in Psalm 119. That's how we did it back when there were just a handful of us. It'd be pretty hard to do now. Thankful for all of you that tap in with us, not only on the live teachings from countries around the world as well as in our United States, but the playbacks that are made available to you by the diligent efforts of our folks that work that side of things. So, whatever got me off on that? Remnant of Joseph, sure. Singularly unique phrase in the Word, as Dr. Earl would say, singularly unique. There's no place else in the Word where this particular arrangement of words occurs. And it jumped to me a few weeks ago as I was reading this great section of Amos in which Jesus Christ is the raiser, R-A-I-S-O-R, or E-R, of David's tabernacle, and the great allegorical significance of those words in that red thread definition of Amos. And right within this is the remnant of Joseph. Now, one of the things that perhaps has occurred to some of you, may have mentioned it, was, of course, in Volume 1, Bestow More Abundant Honor, starting on page 51, if my memory serves, running all the way to page 76, I handle the 9 occurrences of the word fire in the book of Amos. Now, who in the world's ever done that outside of what I've done with you? 9 occurrences of the word fire. And it's in a section where I'm expounding upon the metaphorical use of fire in reference to energizing the gift of Holy Spirit, and especially speaking in tongues. What was it that appeared over their heads to them by revelation? Tongues like as of fire. So keying off of that, I got a whole section, and within that section is this interlude of the 9 occurrences of fire from the book of Amos. And in that, I go through all those different unbelieving civilizations, unbelieving nations that were attacking Israel. Now, as I reread that section this past week, in light of discovering this phrase, the remnant of Joseph, I don't ever remember this phrase registering for me with all those many hours I spent in the great revelation of Amos. This phrase, remnant of Joseph, which of course defines our remnant household today as to what is available in the quality of his life, had never arrested my attention. I guess I had plenty of other things on my mind. But now I see how remarkable this is. So in the context of those 9 occurrences of fire, the remnant of Joseph occurs after the first 8. So there's the new beginning, the regeneration, the resurrection, the new wine energized into the remnant of Joseph. And then the final, the 9th, and finality of judgment, the final word of discerning on the subject, comes later in chapter 7. But sometime you might enjoy, like I have the past week or so, rereading or reading maybe for the first time with attention that section in light of this phrase that we are, for our learning, we can claim all the attributes, all the blessings, all the riches, all the fruit, all the qualities of being a remnant of Joseph, whose name means profitable, fruitful bough, etc., harvest, how these things tie together. So, also, before we get into Genesis, a couple of my lyrical meditations I thought were appropriate in light of our subject. In my booklet, Thou Desirest Truth in the Inward Parts. which after the work on renouncing hidden things of dishonesty was the second work we got published for our Remnant, which of course there's a audio track of me reading all of these available through archives.org or through Valerie's wonderful emails that she sends out to you week by week. She has a link where you can just touch on it. Look at me talking like a computer freak. There's a link there you can touch on, and it brings it right up with me reading these one right after the other if you'd enjoy that. I just had a nice email this past week, someone that told me how much they've been getting blessed listening to it through the day. Page 14 has one called Future Now. And it's in light of Israel's promise to reach the promised land, likewise our promise of the perfection coming in the new body and other elements here. But I thought it fit with our work in Genesis. Future Now, Zion-shaped networks form. See, now the word Zion is politically charged in our day, and the biblical use of Zion has relatively nothing to do with the way it's manipulated today. I guess today a Zionist is a fanatic Jew who wants to throw everybody out of their promised land, however the United Nations defined it back in 1948, with the infamous white papers thinking they were returning the true Israel to their promised land. What a bunch of baloney that is. And it increases in baloney day by day. But a Zionist is apparently a very fanatical Jew who doesn't want anyone around but other Jews, which is impossible to define anyway, genetically and every other way. But anyway, that's their confusion, not yours and mine. That's their chaos. The true Israel is held in abeyance since Pentecost, held in abeyance until the gathering together. The authentic Israel Church of the Bride will be rejuvenated after the gathering together for responsibilities in the sixth administration as a unit, the Church of the Bride. We, of course, are the Church of the Body. When I say Zion-shaped, I'm using it in terms of my spiritual understanding. Zion was what was called the city of David. When they took Jerusalem back, the city of David was the highest point in Jerusalem. That is where the Ark of the Covenant was placed until later when the Temple of Solomon was finished and it was moved there. But, well, that might not be accurate. I think it was scattered abroad sometime after, but not sure on that one. But the point is, the Ark of the Covenant, which David brought back to Jerusalem and danced before it, before the Lord with all his might in 2 Samuel 6:14. It was placed at the highest pinnacle elevation of the city, called the City of David. That was Zion. Zion means a sunny place, S-U-N-N-Y, meaning undiluted light, undiluted light. So, in the logic of my mind, I see commitment in that. A Zionist, spiritually and biblically, is someone fully committed to Jehovah Elohim, doctrinally and practically. So that's why I put the word in there. Zion-shaped networks form, matrices of support and sustenance unto need, web-like gossamers with gaps to fill. For now relax, be stillness, and know. Conceive, prepare, work out and through with disciplined aesthetics to delight him and his ways. The law of the Spirit of life says live. Serve follows live. Antecedent to live, not precede for future now. The eighth matrix of life awaits full discovery, guided by the treasured seven. I'm referring to the 8 sections of the book of Acts here. Worship, observe, bathe in his lovely elixir. dreaming the possible, impossibly to happen in future now. In other words, this is a down payment of the blessings of God in the life more than abundant. But the perfection of what we are living now, we anticipate at the gathering together. Flame into being from the lightning strikes of activated love. Oh, that's a great line, isn't it? Even if I do say so my own self. Flame into being. You do not literally exist before God unless you are inflamed spiritually. That's true. Flame into being. You know, Acts 17:28, in him we live and move, kinetically, and have our being. That just backs up what I just said, in case you want to argue with me. Flame into being from the lightning strikes of activated love. Koheleth collecting. Koheleth is the Hebrew transliterated word for the book of Ecclesiastes. It's actually the translation of the word preacher. Solomon is called the preacher, and they've misunderstood this. Bullinger explains this. Koheleth means a collector, someone who collects truth from around the world, truth from multiple texts, truth from multiple life experiences. Solomon was the great Koheleth. I believe there's, see there I go on my memory, but there's a significant number of Koheleth that occurs in all through Ecclesiastes. Bullinger's explanation is brilliant on this. Koheleth collecting. See, I'm collecting, you're collecting. I'm collecting terms and concepts and figures of speech through experience, through reading, through study, from the Word and outside sources. I'm a Koheleth in what I put together in this little booklet. Koheleth collecting, contemplating, culling. Farm agriculturists know what culling, C-U-L-L-I-N-G, means. They go through the crop and cull out the best, throw away the rotten, throw away the undeveloped. Culling, to soon instigate without hesitate. In the future now, crystalline rhomboids loaded via roots and vines and blossoms. You know, I don't remember why I chose a rhomboid in a structural matrices, which I initially, but it just a picture of a rhomboid came to my mind, and it seemed massive to me. And that's why I put it in here, as I was sort of writing by inspiration. Just Father was feeding me these words, and I was pulling these terms from my previous learning to endeavor to explain what I sensed in my heart in the future now of Zion-shaped networks, matrices of support and sustenance, web-like gossamers, meaning there's room to grow and there's gaps to fill, interstices to grow within. Talk about the eighth matrix of life, an arrangement of systemized organization, the great eighth section of Acts, guided by the previous treasured seven. Hey, a lot going on in here. Did you ever notice? Crystalline rhomboids loaded via roots and vines and blossoms to sparkling support systems waiting to be catalyzed with the animated fires of charismata. Of course, that's gifts of God's grace. Watch this, a 7,000 reserved to serve in future now. Wow, I didn't even put a period there. That must have been a mistake by revelation. That means it continues. 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee to Baal. You remember Romans 11, 1-5? And I've spoken of that on occasion, where if it's not literal, it's certainly figurative in the impact of our remnant of Joseph today. And then I like the next one also, galaxy of praise. Galaxy of praise, sparkling iridescently with pinnacles of expression. See, that's the kalos, the ideal, original to the ears of God. Resplendent words of pristine vivacity, living symbols created of the Father, reverberating from the fountain of light within. narratives of worship to the Father of light, unveiling details of law previously reserved, now poured forth scintillating in the Creator's heart. Well, I think that stuff just ties in beautifully. Now, expounding upon our remnant of Joseph, just going to start reading and do my best to set some broad strokes of truth like I've been doing. And then where inspired details occur, I'll blend those in. We've gone through chapters 37 and 39. Chapter 38 is a parenthetical digression dealing with Judah. Bullinger has a great note on this at the end of chapter 38. This parenthetical chapter is inserted here. It is here by the figure parakbasis, which is the figure digression. It comes historically before chapter 37, so that was tremendous note there. So 37 to 39 is the narrative in continuance. And remember, from 39 we saw in verse 3, and his master saw that the Lord, that's Jehovah, was with him, and that the Lord Jehovah made all that he did to prosper in his hand. That's his enslavement to Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian. His brothers previously, we read that treacherous account of how their jealousy, their envy, their hatred led them to sell him into slavery. And we see God's hand and design through here. Joseph stayed faithful. I'm sure he had some moments where he had to work on his mind. He was definitely hurt by how his brothers had treated him, but he worked his way through it and got his believing heart up to dealing with the situation in which he found himself. And through his faithfulness and his quality, he saved the Christ line. He saved the nation of Israel from starvation. The famine was sent by the adversary as another attack on the Christ line, the believer line, to destroy the seed, because he knew the promise of Genesis 3:15. It was stated to him as a confrontation after he had enticed Eve and Adam. So he knew there was a bloodline, and all through the Word, the Old Testament especially, you can see him trying to stamp out the Christ line and all of God's wonderful flexibility, mind-blowing flexibility to keep it alive. And he never violated anyone's free will. He had to work with the hatred and envy of the brothers. He had to work around it, over it, under it. He had to find a singled-out Joseph who was willing to stay faithful and endure the hardship necessary to carry out the will of the Father. Remember, I read you that Acts 9. Let's read it again. It's very important. When Saul waited in the street called Straight in the house of Judas, waited for what the Father had in mind for him, for 3 days and 3 nights blind, without food or drink, working through the Word he knew from the Old Testament in light of the new birth. He had just seen the resurrected Lord Jesus on the road to Damascus. And in Acts 9, the Lord said unto Ananias, Arise and go into the street which is called Straight. See, there's word of wisdom and word of knowledge all wrapped up in one phrase. Arise and go is wisdom. Where is he supposed to go? Street which is called Straight, knowledge. He never would have known that without the revelation. See, this wisdom and knowledge is like a tapestry. There will be times in life where the word of knowledge will come priority. It'll be important. You'll be alerted by revelation to a scenario to get involved in. Then the word of wisdom. But also, as we see in records like this, many times the wisdom is first. Arise and go. Or like he said to Philip in Acts 8, he said to Philip in verse 29, then the Spirit, that's usage 1 via 5, said unto Philip, Go near, word of wisdom, and join thyself to this chariot. That's knowledge. go near and join. Okay, I'm ready, but where? With whom? The chariot. That chariot, you see, that guy sitting in it, word of knowledge. You see, it's a combination of revelation and common sense in life, isn't it? It's a combination. That's why we're diligent with our five senses. We're diligent to pay attention to what's going on around us. We're diligent to take care of our physical surroundings, keeping things decent and in order, keeping things versatile and aesthetic, keeping things not only clean but stimulating in our particular promised land domiciles, keeping it stimulating, freshening. So it works best, it suits our minds best to remember the Word and think the Word. Ah, boy. Deb got this beautiful bulb from one of her relatives, one of these fast-growing things, and it shot up in days, and it's got these 4 gorgeous blossoms. They look like megaphones. I've even seen megaphones on light poles at ball games. That's exactly, they're all pointing out in 4 different directions. And it's just so beautiful. It's so lovely. And we've had it on our dining room table, and I asked her this morning if I could bring it out here and put it in the living room, because it really inspires me. Because 4 is the number of God's creative works on earth. You got these beautiful blossoms exuding the sweet-smelling savor. I'm endeavoring to bring God's creative works into a horizontal level as I teach, and the way it's on this straight stem, strong, straight, standing. I just, the other day I was sharing with her about how it reminds me of the Greek word oxano and the enzyme auxins, A-U-X-I-N, which I elaborate on in my book, The Rise and Expansion of the Christian Church. Auxins are an enzyme in plants that cause the roots to grow towards water and the blossom or the stem to grow towards the light. Well, what a perfect example of your life and mine. So I look at that thing and it inspires and stirs all kinds of tremendous godly thoughts, like with everything I've got hanging on my walls, every color scheme. It all reminds me of something in the Word. It keeps me kinetically moved in His presence. In Him I live and move and have my being. That's just an example of what I mean. It's a common sense, disciplined walk. You know, no one paid more attention to the senses surroundings than Dr. Wierwille did. He saw things that we missed all the time. I have an incident in my book, VP and Me. My first week in the residence corps, he wanted to do an early morning teaching, so we were there. I think it was maybe 6:30 or 7, because the sun was starting to come up. This was in September of 71, back before the earth cooled. I don't know. Yeah, we had electricity then, running water, indoor plumbing. We were living large. So we all get into the session, and we're all wired to the gills to hear the Word, of course. We just want to learn the Word. And the first thing he said to us, did you notice coming up on the East 40 there, all the cobwebs on the grass? The spiders had been out in the night weaving. It's like a beautiful crystalline pattern as the sun came up and sparkled on the moisture on the cobwebs. Did you notice that this morning, kids? And, of course, we all stared at him like he was from Mars. What? And, of course, in my early days of spiritual immaturity, I have to tell you, my thought was, cobwebs? Who cares about cobwebs? Teach us something. And, of course, I quickly reproved myself when I realized, here's the man of God telling me that he noticed the spider webs on the east lawn sparkling with dew as the sun came up, as a gorgeous picture of God's watching over the earth and the unique things He does. And boy, I tell you, I never doubted that kind of thing again. I picked up real quick how deeply and disciplinedly, if that's a word, He paid attention to what was going on around Him. You know, I was a new believer. I'd only had the class a few months before. I'm ready to get revelation every second of my life. This was my pipe dream, like perhaps many of you thought it was going to be too. And of course I had to learn, sometimes the hard way, that it wasn't going to be like that. but because he began teaching us things, the first words out of his mouth in our very first WACOR meeting was talking about the spider webs on the lawn. I tell you, right away, I started paying more attention to what was going on around me. It's a balance. It's a symmetry. That's what the kalos, that perfection that belongs only to God. Now, yeah, people sometimes go overboard with the sense knowledge side, and they miss the spiritual, the revelation, the energizing of the manifestations. Well, then they have to bend. I've done that as well. You have to bend your way back to the center lane, the center of his will. Sometimes we can make a mistake by trusting in the spiritual side at the expense of the senses realm. Now, I'm not saying the spiritual is dominant. The body holds the same relationship to the reason, subordinate to reasoning. That's the way it's supposed to work, as reason does to the spirit. Yes, the spirit, the prevailing word, is always preeminent. But there's a symmetrical balance between body and soul and spirit. I often quote to you that share your abundance with me in my responses. I quote 1 Thessalonians 5:23. Now I pray God that in your entire spirit and soul and body ye may be preserved blameless unto the coming, blameless, spiritually prepared, spiritually clean, spirit and soul and body. So the great art of living is living with that blended walk between body and soul and spirit, of course. And I love in 1 Thessalonians 5 where spirit is first. It just reiterates that wonderful syllogism he gave us years ago. The body holds the same relationship to reason as reason does to the spirit. I don't know if that's a syllogism or not. It's the best thing I can think of. It's a schematic arrangement of concepts that really keeps you in order when you learn to think it through and utilize it in your practical life. When sometimes life gets frenzied and you've got all these gnats in your face, practical things coming at you, finances, health, family issues, whatever it might be, physical situations in the homes you live in or the environment you live in, things that need to be repaired or taken care of, and you start feeling overwhelmed. How many times I brought back to mind that little formula Dr. World gave us years ago. Body, then reason, then spirit. Okay, it'll just remind me, all right? I'm going to sit here quiet. I'm going to speak in tongues first. And it's just boom. All those priorities will start arranging themselves. The Father will start arranging what's priority in my mind. Heck, I was doing that up to a few minutes before I checked in with Bruce and Valerie on the hookup today. I had to do this. I had to do that. I had to put this on or that on. I had to get this mint, this water, this. And I sat down and I thought I had everything ready, and my phone was hanging up here. I hadn't grabbed my phone. Thank God Deb walked up here and said, "Do you need anything?" "Only my phone." "Will you hand me that, please?" You see, but the Spirit of God will arrange the priorities so you don't act out of frenzy. Most people just act out of the first thing that jumps between their eyes or the first thing that seems the most threatening. And sometimes that's just the enemy trying to run you. He's manipulating. He's exploiting by way of the old nature and the prince of the power of the air. He's attacking. He's exploiting. So be still and know that I am Elohim. I got a picture on my wall, a great picture, a brilliant charcoal sketch of a mountain man sitting in the midst of this gorgeous wilderness scene. It's obviously a winter scene. The ice is on the tree, beautifully set in the background. He's got his magnificent mountain man garb made out of animal skins, hat, robe, couple of layers, mittens on, and he's got his musket across his knee, and he's enjoying a pipe. I love it. It always reminds me of sweet-smelling savor, and he's quiet, and it's obviously peaceful around him. You can tell by the tree that there's no gale, no wind. It's a time to be quiet. And that every time I look at it, it reminds me of like scriptures like Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am Elohim. Be still means be at rest, be tranquil, be at leisure. A German text I found years ago says, be at leisure and know. I've worked this scripture, so see, as I'm quoting the scripture to my mind, I'm reminding myself of detail. The broad stroke of the word, be still and know that I am God, that's a blessing, but now certain detail blended in. Know is gnosko. Experientially know. Experientially know that I am. Present tense, I am. Not even will be. I am. Be still and know that I am. And the word God is Elohim, the Creator. How do we know the Creator experientially? By energizing the gift of Holy Spirit into manifestation, most fundamentally and dynamically, speaking in tongues. That picture gels all those thoughts. I'm just staring at it right now. Look at that. All that just in my mind, in my heart, in daily living. Another one is study, to be quiet. 1 Thessalonians 4:11. Study to be tranquil. Study to be at rest. And the word study there is not in terms of what you might think. I've taught this in previous sessions. Study, Dr. Earl taught us, and I've never forgotten it. From the first time he taught it back in 1975, I've never forgotten it. Study means to exert yourself out of self-love. Exert yourself out of self-respect to be tranquil at rest. Now there's a great element of a life more than abundant. When you realize you're being pushed around by circumstances, pushed around, you can see that your self-respect is waning. I get that way. Well, I feel like I'm being jerked around by circumstances or jerked around by some idiot's opinion of me. Some hard-hearted moron who has an opinion of me that I know cuts across the righteousness of God in Christ that I am. I have no self-respect. I'm not respecting myself too much, so that even that's an indicator. See, you learn to recognize that. Now, wait a minute. The more I go deeper into considering that or letting this circumstance push me around, get me nervous, get me frenzied, anxious, the less I even respect my own mind. All right, this is over with. To hell with that, or even stronger language sometimes helps me. And I sit down and get quiet and engage the gift of Christ in me. And then it's just like a bunch of building blocks. You've seen, some of you play those computer games where you, I forget the, I don't know the name of it. People seem to like it, where you build things and you put blocks in here and blocks in there. It all just comes together. The priority of action just clicks, clicks, clicks. All right, I'm at rest. Not only am I loving God, but that's authentic self-respect now. Keeps the accuser out too, doesn't it? Whole lot of benefits of that kind of thinking. Study, exert yourself out of self-respect, self-love, to be tranquil, to be at rest. All revelation comes when one is at peace. It would be phenomena, which is very rare, but it would be phenomena for a man or a woman to get revelation when they weren't at rest, tranquil, within, on the inside. Now, there might be chaos all around us. And you and I that have lived this word for decades, some of you know what that's like. But I'm at peace in the revelation he's given me, and none of the chaotic movement around me or the bad opinions around me affect my alignment and harmony in body and soul and spirit. The body holding the same relationship to my reasoning, subservient to my reasoning, as reasoning is subservient to the Spirit of God. Well, the Spirit said unto Philip, go near and join thyself to this chariot. You can see word of wisdom, word of knowledge, and common sense. And Philip ran thither to him. This is the scripture years ago that arrested my attention, that within the athletic allegory, when the word says run, its revelation has been engendered. When the word says walk, it's involving the renewed mind walk on the written word and the common sense of life. And of course, in life situations, you have combinations, tapestry-like of all. And Philip ran. That means he had revelation. Now here he physically ran, but God put the record in here so that I could understand that in the athletic spirit of the Spirit category, to run implies word of wisdom, word of knowledge, word discerning of spirits, brought to pass by the manifestation of believing, resulting in either or both, a working of a miracle or a gift of healing. There you go. Let's go back. I wanted to read, we're on Ananias, and the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the street which is called Straight, and inquire in the house of Judas. Boy, this is very specific information. No way he'd have known to do this without that word of knowledge for one called Saul. He tells him the house to find. He tells him the street, the house, and the man to be looking for. He's of Tarsus. That told him his nationality. For behold, he prayeth. That told him what he's going to be doing. So all these are checkpoints. Okay, straight. There I see it. House of Judas inquires. Okay, that's there. Saul, he's from Tarsus, and he's going to be praying. And has seen in a vision a man named Ananias. That's you. Coming in and putting his hand on him, telling him exactly what to do, that he might receive his sight. Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard by many of this man. See, if you have doubts or worries, complain to the one that gave you the revelation. He'll straighten us out. You don't have to run around calling your buddy. How much evil, Kakos, he hath done to thy saints at Jerusalem. Very accurate. And here he hath authority from the chief priests to bind all that call on thy name. But the Lord said unto him, Go thy way. Go thy way. Now, he could have stopped there. He's God. But look at his loving heart. Ananias is willing to obey. He didn't hold his question against him. Ananias wanted to perform his will, but he had this fear, this anxiety, which is very understandable. So he gives him more word of knowledge to reassure him, for he is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name. And he goes even, you talk about Ephesians 3:20, receiving exceeding abundantly above all. Ananias really wanted to know. You know, in the census world, they say that's, what, too much information, they call it, TMI. Well, it never is with God. God knows if I need to know more than I'm asking for. That's for darn sure. Don't ever accuse him of TMI or me when I teach you the word. To bear my name before the Gentiles. Nope, I skipped it. No, I'm in the right place. And kings and the children of Israel. Good grief. That's about all there is in the world, the known world. Gentiles are the nations. Kings are the big hot Joes that run the nations. And the children of Israel. There's hardly anything left. For I will show him. For is reason why. In other words, this is a condition that he's going to have to learn. Same with us. I will show him how great things he must endure. Suffer is endure. Takes a little bit of the edge off. For my name's sake. That's the record of Joseph. That's what Joseph endured. He endured to carry forth the truth, didn't he? One of the great examples of all time in God's wonderful word. Now, I'm reading the Joseph records now. I'm going to be reading from the Companion Bible, if you have one, if you want to follow along, either way, with broad strokes and some inspired detail. So we see that Potiphar recognized Jehovah working in him and trusted him with his house. Then his wife did a great wickedness unto Joseph by accusing him falsely to cover for her own error of character, accused him, and Potiphar believed the wife. Thank God he didn't execute him. He must have been reminded of some of the goodness that was in Joseph. He sent him to prison. But look what happened in verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph. It wasn't Joseph's fault all this happened. Circumstances many times do attack us. Dr. Earl had a great line that he got from a great man of God that he learned from as a young man. Was that Star Daily? I think so. Where he said, Rufus Mosley. Two of his favorite people as a young man, Rufus Mosley and Star Daily. Rufus Mosley is the man that tried to lead Dr. Earl into speaking in tongues when he was a young man, young minister. And Rufus Mosley said to Vic, he said, Vic, I've never known anyone as hungry for the Spirit as you are. I'm sorry I don't know how to lead you into it, but when you get it, there'll be nobody like you. And he often quoted Rufus Mosley. I'm paraphrasing. Rufus Mosley was the one that he named one foot glory and the other hallelujah. So every time he went anywhere, it was glory, hallelujah. Apparently he was a tremendous guy, great sense of humor. It was Rufus Mosley that said, you can't always keep the devil from kicking you, but you can determine which way you go. See, that's Joseph. Which way he went in his mind. Yes, he was kicked into slavery. Yes, he was kicked into Potiphar's house. Then he was kicked out and into prison. But he determined his motive. He determined his discipline. He determined his response, like we have done over the years. See, I think one reason this record is so much of a blessing, and that it's now that I wake up to that great phrase, remnant of Joseph. This not only gives us direction and encouragement for the days ahead, but in the future now that we're living, this will explain and gratify to see in your own life that this is what you have done in your way, what I have done in perhaps my small way compared to a Joseph. I'm sure we all feel pretty small, like to Paul and, of course, Jesus Christ. But we can see similarities. We have been unjustly accused. We have been unjustly kicked out of one situation to another. We have been unjustly treated, and yet we have recovered. Maybe we didn't recover as quickly as a Joseph, but we have recovered. We have gotten back to God first. We have laid the hurt aside, and we have moved forward with Him working in us to will and to do of His good pleasure. And perhaps we are seeing great benefit and profit. I think we are, that you have labored and endured to be a part of our great remnant adventure in His wonderful, matchless Word. So in some ways, it's not only an incentive for the future, but it's a comfort. It's a self-assurance. And yes, it's a self-respect. It's a self-respect that you indeed have endured to come to this point. I certainly look at it that way in the privacy of my heart. But the Lord was with Joseph, Jehovah, and showed him mercy. Now, the word mercy bothered me because mercy is the withholding of deserved wrath. I don't see any wrath that Joseph deserved. And thank God Bullinger's note says mercy here is the word for kindness. And I think that's distinctively different. Yes, we do need mercy and grace both at times. We have tripped up. We have opened the door to attack, wrath. And God covers as we come back to Him. But for Joseph, I don't see that understanding of mercy could possibly fit here. I drew a line through mercy, and it's kindness. Kindness is a unique fruit of the Spirit, uniquely has its distinctive differences. I think you can see that. And gave him favor. That's grace. Okay, I can dig that. God's divine unmerited favor. Sure, every human needs that. By the grace of God, I am what I am. The great Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15:10. That's one of my favorite retemeries. I do not frustrate the grace of God, Paul adamantly stated to those law-based, bewitched Galatians. in chapter 2, verse 21. I do not frustrate the grace of God. That's been one of my great confessions for these last 20 or 30 years. I just don't let the accuser get to me, no matter who's the conduit, who he's using. I do not frustrate the grace of God. So get out of my face, that crap. Gave him grace in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's stand. Now this keeper was the governor, like the warden, the guy in charge, the warden. Usually in all the prison movies they make, the warden's a mean, nasty guy, isn't he? Well, in this case, this guy, here's a body-soul, domesticated animal that had enough good sense to see the quality of a man's life like Joseph. And you indeed have run across folks like that. So have I. I think sometimes they're born again, but they're not really on the Word. But their kindness, they see the quality of our lives, they extend favors to us. Of course we've seen that. Likewise, we've seen the venal animals at times try to attack us as well. So it's good to make that distinction. Do good unto all, especially the household of faith. Where are we here? Verse, keeper of the prison, verse 22. To Joseph's hand, his responsibility, all the prisoners that were in the prison. What a man Joseph is that he accepted that responsibility. He's just a young man. During these years, he was thrown into slavery when he was 17, the best I can ascertain from Genesis 37. And when Pharaoh puts him in charge of all, second in command to him later, to administer the abundance, the word says he's 30 years old. So we've got 13 years between his brother's devilish decision to sell him into slavery, his time in Potiphar's house, then his time in prison. You've got 13 years before Egypt was ready for a man to lead them out of the distress that was coming, and the Pharaoh was ready to get the revelation, the vision God gave him. All these factors had to be arranged. You see, God never violated anyone's free will. He had to wait on people to have the heart and the capability to get ready. And perhaps even Joseph needed this experience of overseeing these prisoners for years. He perhaps needed this training to be ready to take on the mammoth responsibility of saving the known world from famine. I think that makes some sense. And Joseph, sure, he wants to get out of prison. He's been unjustly accused, of course, but he took profit and advantage of the learning. His need was met. These men in prison certainly cared for him and loved him. There's no indication that he'd had any kind of animosity or savagery that came at him, because they respected him, and he was responsible for their housing and feeding and staying healthy and their medical attention, and he had to be the best there ever was at taking care of a bunch of prisoners. No one could have touched him. Great example, isn't it? But I think he needed that experience to get him ready for Egypt, at least to some extent, okay? Maybe the butcher and the baker incident indicates it didn't have to go as long as it did, but he certainly needed the experience to prepare him, and he was certainly ready. Another thing, of course, we know from Eastern culture that a man wasn't considered an adult until he was 30. So perhaps culturally he needed those years also. So those are interesting details to consider. And all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. Took care of them, lock, stock, and barrel, body, soul, and spirit. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord Jehovah was with him, Joseph, and that which he, Joseph, did, the Lord Jehovah made it to prosper. All right, we'll take our 15 minutes and pick up on this magnificent saga of the man of God, Joseph. For we are the remnant of Joseph. Bless your heart. Now we're in Genesis chapter 40. And it came to pass after these things. See, sometimes the word gives you time references. In other words, was it 3 days after? Was it a year after? And obviously sometimes it doesn't. So if it doesn't say, we don't need to know. The point is just to keep the narrative moving. That the butler or cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. Now, I hadn't thought of this before until my last read-through here. This must have been a poison attempt on the life of the Pharaoh. And before he could resolve who was responsible, he just put them both in prison. The cupbearer was not only the one that served, he was the one that was responsible to oversee all the meals. You know, you've heard of kings having tasters, people that eat or drink what's served to him. So if they drop dead, it didn't kill him. Boy, what a great job that would be, huh? But that's the way it worked with all the intrigue and inner workings of the politics and such, and the hatreds and the envy. So I would imagine this was a poison thing. Makes sense. The cupbearer, the server, or the overseer of the serving, and the baker, the man preparing the food, would be the most likely candidates who had committed the crime. This is just my thinking in between the lines, which we're allowed to do. I think it makes sense. Verse 3, and he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard, into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them. And they continued a season in ward, incarcerated. Bullinger has a note, Hebrew season refers to days, either some days or perhaps a year. May have been up to a year. Verse 5, and they dreamed a dream. This phrase, dreamed of a dream, is the figure of speech polyptoton. Literally means had a significant or important dream or vision. Vision is a better word here. Each man his vision in one night. Each man according to the interpretation of his vision. The butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, pay attention, especially, they were sad. Look at the diligence of this man Joseph, checking on his inmates, checking on, taking responsibility, paying attention to how they were acting, their countenance. This common sense care and kindness was what made him such a great overseer. So here it wasn't a case of revelation. He just noticed them with his eyes, paid attention, didn't just blow by people like most people are prone to do. How many employers have you ever worked for that would have noticed that you had some sadness in your heart, or you were upset by something? Might have helped. Sometimes they have, haven't they? And that certainly elevates them in our spiritual opinion. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his Lord's house, saying, wherefore look ye so sadly today? That again indicates his loving heart. You know, how many people have noticed that we aren't doing so good and they don't give a hoot? It's none of my business. I got enough problems of my own. Look at this Joseph, overseer of the whole prison. Who knows how many prisoners in there? I'm sure it was more than 9 or 10. I'm sure there was a pretty good crowd in the days of Pharaoh of Egypt. Might have been hundreds. And since they're new, he's double checking on them. Probably checked on everybody. And he stops and asks them, why are you so sad? See, without that discipline of concern, authentic concern in a believer's heart, it never could have led to the great revelations that follow. Without that simple question of loving concern, how about that for an inspired detail? All the revelations that followed that saved the nation of Israel, saved the Christ line, hypothetically, could have been wiped out in the famine. Because remember, the Christ line came through Judah. Not Joseph, but through Judah, which we later clarify in Genesis 49 in Jacob's prophecies. But we know that beforehand. And they said unto him, we have dreamed a vision, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, do not interpretations belong to Elohim? Tell me them, I pray you. Inspired utterance. He had no right to offer this unless he had what? Revelation. Word of wisdom, word of knowledge. But again, without the simple kindness of noticing they were sad and being concerned about it, asking how they were. And to me, he didn't need revelation to be concerned. He was concerned. He was a great man of God, great young man. These were his responsibility. He had learned responsibility from his father, Jacob. Israel, later named Israel. Well, he'd been named Israel by this time. And the discipline of his concern that he showed. He showed it when he was so enthused to visit his brothers out with the flocks and herds to report back to the father. It's something he wanted to do as a young man of 17. He wanted responsibility, which of course led to him being so terribly mistreated. But God, you talk about an example of God working all things together for good to them that love him. How about this one? But again, the discipline of his concern for those with whom and for whom he was responsible. That didn't require revelation. If that would have required revelation, he was not the man God needed in the situation. It just simply required the love of God that was in his heart and taking diligent concern for his responsibilities. That reminds me, let's go back to Genesis 25. This will add sustenance to what I've just been harping on. You can see why I'm so convinced of this, because you read the context about these men. His father, Jacob, in Genesis 25, verse 27. This is the father, Jacob. And the boys grew. And Esau, that's his twin brother, was a cunning hunter, skillful, artful. A man of outdoor life, one of the texts says. A man dwelling in the field or of the field in open country. Like that mountain man up on my wall, I guess. Although my image is a lot better man than Esau was. And Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. Now you got to look up plain. That might have negative connotations in English, in our language. And certainly you know I did. Plain from, I think this is from Wilson's Old Testament word studies. But anyway, it means undefiled, complete, dear, D-E-A-R, upright, pure. And here's a note I found in one of the references. Jacob took seriously life's ordinary duties. Now that's the man who raised up Joseph. That's the father of the great man of God, Joseph. So you can just simply say these same qualities, you can see them already, were in the young man Joseph. And that's why he paid attention to how his inmates or fellow prisoners that he was responsible for were doing. Isn't that beautiful? Wow. Now, in a great reference book I've used over the years, I've referred to it before. The title of it is Old Testament Light, the indispensable guide to the customs, manners, and idioms of biblical times by George M. Lamsa. Some Corps gave this to me years ago, back in the 90s, and I had never heard of it. Of course, I knew of Lamsa's Bible, and many great stories Dr. Earl told us about George Lamsa coming to teach at summer schools at the Way International in the 60s. Matter of fact, it was in Dr. Earl's house where Dr. Lamsa finished the final perusal of his Bible in manuscript form. The final perusal before it went to the publisher was finished in the home of Victor Paul and Mrs. Wierwille. Isn't that something? Dr. Wierwille was very thankful, spiritually proud of that. But I had never heard of this work, and this Corps couple had found it, and I've just benefited from it over the years. I would imagine you can find it like you online searchers know how to do. Maybe somebody years ago, I don't know how long ago it was. It was when I was in Toledo. I found that Lamsa still had a functioning headquarters somewhere in Florida. Of course, he'd fallen asleep, but some of his followers were keeping it was either a publishing place or some kind of meeting house going, and perhaps his books can be still found even in new forms. But I want to read you his comment on this Genesis 40, verse 8. He titles it Dreams. In the olden days, the chief occupation of the wise and the learned was to interpret dreams, explain riddles and dark sayings, and to foretell things to come. Now see, reading that with my knowledge of the Word, I would interpret that to mean that he helps people understand revelations, genuine, authentic revelations, speaking from a godly point of view. Of course, we're very aware that there's a whole spiritualism side to this in cultures, but speaking from a godly point of view. Sometimes people have authentic revelations. They don't quite understand them. I've seen Dr. Wierwille help people understand. I've had that privilege on a few occasions through the years where people sensed something or had pictures and even heard things, and they wanted to check with me on the authenticity of it. Matter of fact, I just had an illustration of that within the last 24 hours. Revelation given to one of our remnant, and she wanted to make sure the way she responded to it and carried out what she was sensing to do was authentic. And I called her up yesterday and reassured her of a letter she had written and how blessed I was to read what she laid out. It was a great discerning of spirits revelation. Tremendous. Boy, isn't that amazing? I'm sort of took my breath away. That happened to me just yesterday. Now, explain riddles and dark sayings. Well, that every time we explain an Orientalism, every time we explain a figure of speech, I'd say that's in that category, isn't it? As workmen of the Word. Foretell things to come. Well, that's a little more specific. Most of my foretelling is in terms of what I can read right from the Word. I just told you about the gathering together coming. It's future now. In a way, that's foretelling. Not originated in my revelation, but I'm certainly reiterating what is a revelation in terms of the future. Got the right to do that as God works in a man's heart, like I did reading future now to you earlier. See how I think this stuff through, work this stuff? This knowledge was handed down from father to son and from a teacher to his student. That's excellent. Assyrians, Babylonians, and Egyptians had astrologers, soothsayers, and interpreters of dreams. Okay, that's obviously the counterfeit side. He goes on to write, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob communed with God by means of dreams and visions and revelations. You see, if possible, I'd just take the word dream out. But like I've explained, there could be a phenomena where a dream could be appropriate. But most of the time, what people call revelation by dreams is going to be in the spiritualism, the hooky-pook category, as Dr. Werwell called it. Okay, communed with God by means of dreams and visions and revelations. And they understood the meaning of the symbols which they saw in their dreams. Then he talks about Jacob's ladder, which his interpretation is a bit different than what I have taught, but the point is that the ladder was also obviously a symbol of God communicating down to the level of the senses by way of angelic mediating. That's the way I put it together, which I still think is quite accurate. Well, that's a dandy. Verse 9 of Genesis 40. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my vision, behold, a vine was before me. And in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. And I took the grapes, and I pressed them. Bullinger has a note on religious ceremonies and the worship of Horus, the Egyptian god. The existence of vines in Egypt has been denied by critics, but now they are seen depicted in paintings. In the cup was honey or some other liquid with which the grape juice was mixed. Interesting, isn't it? Pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, this is the interpretation of it. Now, we could guess all kinds of interpretations here, couldn't we? Based on our background, our lives, what branches and clusters and grapes and such mean to us. Well, you're going to be in a grocery store, and you're going to see a cluster of seedless grapes, and you're going to go, or seed, no. See, people go off on anything. This was revelation. He said interpretations belong to whom? Elohim, the Creator. So this requires a created revelation for a man to be able to boldly speak it. Because of the caliber and quality of his life, because of the proving of himself through the hardships he'd already been through, Joseph had complete confidence that this was Elohim showing him the interpretation of it. Man, is that inspiring. And we are the remnant of Joseph. We can have that kind of confidence, not only to recognize revelations, but even to know in the discipline of our will when we don't have revelation, when it's up to us just to believe the written word and to walk. And yet the distinctions of this walk require in-depth spiritual perception and awareness. Joseph had it, and we are the remnant of Joseph, and this is for our learning. This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head, which means uplift thee, restore thee to favor. For this was the highest honor that the cupbearer could have. And restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner, when thou wast his butler. In other words, he would have been proven innocent in the investigation. But think on me, verse 14. When it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I beg of thee, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. I think Joseph had every right, and I believe that was just as much God working in him, and that ideally, now that I think about it even further, God's primary will would have been for him to be released already. You can see the profit of that. He's already proven he's got the confidence to recognize revelation and interpreting dreams. He didn't need all these other years. So, but many times in the Word, we see that God's primary will does not take place. It doesn't happen. And God has to adapt because he never violates free will. The God who violates free will, makes his living off of violating free will, is Diabolos, Satanas, the accuser, the tempter, the thief, the destroyer, the accuser of the brethren, he who smites with continual stroke, he who hath made this world a wilderness, a jungle, a place of desolation and violence and terror. That's the God who violates free will. You never dare accuse the true God in your life or in your work of the Word as to violating anyone's free will. If you ever think you see that in the Word, you know you're not properly dividing the section. And that can happen. So you either work the keys as we've been taught, or you seek somebody's counsel that will understand it, or you just, as Dr. Earl used to say, hold it in abeyance. It doesn't negate all the other truth you know. You hold it in abeyance till you're smarter. And many times years down the road, like my illustration of the Athletes of the Spirit program, took me years to finally pay attention and recognize there's the answer to the question that guy had asked me about that poster that I got inspired to put up there and put on the programs. Well, beloved, for indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. Well, often sarcastically people say everybody in prison says they're innocent. Well, in this case, he certainly was. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, see, he wanted to wait and see. Sort of shows his character. Appears to me that the butler volunteered first because he knew he was innocent. Here the baker, oh boy, he got a good one, I'll get a good one. Maybe I'm going to get away with it. He said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. Oh boy, he's all jacked up. My baskets are white. Of course, Bullinger's note says wicker. Well, we can dicker over the wicker, or we can just keep reading. I think we'll keep reading. Verse 17, and in the uppermost basket there was of all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh. Oh boy, abundance. And the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. Oh, look at me feeding the birdies. And Joseph answered and said, looks like there was no hesitation. This is the interpretation thereof. Boy, and you better know what you're saying. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the bird shall eat thy flesh from off thee. Wow. Ha! Similarities between the two, but the exact opposite in discerning of spirits, interpretation thereof. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among his servants. Let me read this note of Bullinger's on birthday. These were observed with great ceremony and state. Critics have supposed it to be only a Persian custom. The Rosetta Stone contains a decree concerning the keeping of the birthday feast of Ptolemy Epiphanes. Other evidence also is forthcoming. Egyptian pharaohs had birthday celebrations. Boy, oh boy. Look at the value of this. I don't think even if I've seen a picture of the Rosetta Stone, but I couldn't make tails out of heads. So thankful this man could. Leaves it here for us to benefit from. Father saw to it. Aren't we grateful for all that? Verse 21, and he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, just like the Revelation. And he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, and he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. See, two revelations established Joseph's caliber, his prowess, his capability. Established. He was ready. Capital punishment means he did something to deserve it. And I think the most logical explanation, it must have been a conspiracy of poisoning that the chief baker had organized in the preparation of the food. Probably the butler caught it, but Pharaoh at the time didn't know who was responsible. Makes sense to me. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. See, if I was a screenwriter and I was writing this up for a movie, that's the kind of poetic license screenwriters take to fill in dramatic gaps. And I think it would be a good way to do it. Do a flashback to the poisoning scenarios. The baker's preparing the poison. The butler has no idea. The cupbearer catches it by taste or smell, saves it from going to the banquet. Pharaoh is wroth and sends them both into keeping. That would be a good transitional incident, the way they go back in time. Well, you do that in the Word, too. We just went back to Genesis 25:27, didn't we? Now, verse 23, yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgat him. Figure of speech, pleonasm, used for great emphasis. I don't remember what that is. So, Appendix 6. In my companion Bible of E.W. Bullinger, as Dr. Earl learned, his name was actually pronounced in his lifetime, Bullinger, instead of Jur. Let's see, it's alphabetical. They give these short definitions in here. Okay, pleonasm means redundancy, where what is said is immediately after put in another or opposite way to make it impossible for the sense to be missed. Well, we all need that at times, don't we? Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph? And here's the redundancy properly supplied, but forgot him. The many times I was privileged to hear Dr. Earl teach this record, and he loved teaching this Joseph record. Just always enjoyed it immensely. He always said, that's just human. Isn't that human? So that warns me off from trying to overly spiritualize this. You know, I could jump to a conclusion and say, well, a devil spirit blinded his eyes. See, Dr. Earl always says that's just human. Body, soul. He just forgot. He got wrapped up in the joy of being restored. He got wrapped up in the joy of seeing the butler hung and not him. Grateful that it wasn't him. Grateful that he was recognized as being a faithful servant. His family rejoiced. He rejoiced. He just forgot about the revelation that was properly interpreted. Chapter 41, and it came to pass at the end of 2 full years, okay? Period of time passing. Later we're going to see he was 30. So this would have been from 17 to 28. Period of 11 years. That's the number of chaos. 13 is the number of betrayal and treason. The treason of his brothers, their betrayal. The chaos. So he still obviously had issues to deal with, problems to solve, endurance, like Paul, to endure these things for God's name's sake. like we do as well. But the greatness of the Word gives us the joy to live through when we hit these snags and we overcome them. It's like Dr. will often like to say, problems are just opportunities to believe. And it got where it was even in his vernacular when I'd be sitting in private meetings with him, or he'd be sitting with some of the leadership, or he'd come to this lunchtime and share his heart with us. He'd say, I haven't had a couple of opportunities this morning. He'd say that as a synonym for having a problem to deal with, and he'd explain. Sometimes he sought our help, our prayers, our advice. Sometimes he taught how he handled a scenario, how he took care of it. It's an opportunity to believe when obstacles confront us. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed. And behold, he stood by the river. This is the Nile River, which was the source of all their abundance. And behold, there came out of the river 7 well-favored kine, that's cattle, and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. Bullinger's note, the cow was the emblem of Isis. You've heard of that counterfeit god, Isis. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Osiris is represented as a bull accompanied by 7 cows. Gets this from the British Museum. This was the basis of the dream and gave it such significance and mystery. See, to Pharaoh's understanding. Revelation comes in terms of your understanding. Like pictures God gives you and that perhaps only you would recognize. Pictures from your cultural upbringing, pictures from experiences from the past. In a meadow means among the rushes or the reeds. All right, verse 3. And behold, 7 other kine cattle came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, all scrawny, ribs showing, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine. That's a vivid picture, isn't it? So Pharaoh awoke. Sorry, I'm trying to read 2 things at once here. Pharaoh awoke. There's a guy that's woke, isn't he? The eyes of his understanding getting enlightened, you betcha. And he slept and dreamed the second time. And behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. 7 ears, Bullinger's note, unknown to us but common in Egypt. Rank means fat and good. Dr. Rule would often stop and talk about how amazing a sight this would be. And he talked about the corn that he grew up raising, growing up on the farm in Ohio and being very well versed in the agriculture and all the detail of that. I always loved hearing him talk about that. But he said you could never find 7 ears on a stalk of corn in Ohio. If you have 2, you're rejoicing. If you have 1, you feel blessed. And later, I remember at my first advanced class, about a week after that, a couple of us corps went out into a field of sweet corn. Most of the corn was field corn to be ground up in grain as feed, animal feed, and sold. But he always had an acre or so of sweet corn that we could eat. And this corps guy and I went out. The first time in my life, I pulled and stripped stalks of corn. Remember it vividly. And this record was on my mind. I was very cognizant that every once in a while there'd be 2 stalks on there, 2 ears on a stalk. Obviously, I never saw one with 7. But that riveted the lesson in my mind. I look back on it, and I know that was God working in the corps coordinator that day. He's the one that invited me to come out and pull sweet corn for him to get back to the dining room so they could fix it up for supper later that night. And he's the one that showed me, too, The best time to eat sweet corn is raw, right now off the stalk. So we each ate a ear of it, and it was so sweet. It was unbelievable. Eat it raw, eat it right off the stalk. You get the sweetest flavor out of it. Isn't that interesting? I just thought of that while I was talking about this. And God had me to have that experience right after I'd finished the advanced class, of which one of the high points is when he taught these Joseph records. Verse 6, and behold, 7 thin ears and blasted with the east wind sprung up after them. I like what he says about the east wind. In Egypt, the prevailing winds are north and south. In Palestine, east and west. The wind here is the Chamson, Hebrew Kadam, which is southeast and is a blighting wind. Maybe for some of us, the first time we ever heard of a wind being named is the great musical Oklahoma. They call the wind Mariah. Remember that one? My mom remembers that one. All us Okies like that musical. They call the wind Mariah. I'd never heard of a wind being named in that sense. Well, in Eastern culture, biblical culture, apparently that's, what do they call those California winds that are so hot and arid? Santa Ana, right? Santa Ana winds. First time I ever visited the Bay Area was in the fall, approaching winter. Everything was so brown. I expected California to be all green and lush. Everything was brown. Everything was brown. Remember that vividly. And they talked about the Santa Ana winds blowing in the heat and the aridness from wherever that was, from the desert areas there. So some places they do still name the winds. A blighting wind, blighting, bringing disease, bringing death. Hebrews had only the 4 quarters. Had it said here south, it would have meant nothing. But east conveys the nature of the wind, especially as evil was supposed to come from the east and good from the west, as in other countries. I'd say some of that's still true. You betchem. You betchem, as we'd say in Cherokee. Anyway. So this east wind sprung up after them. In his vision, it's clear to him that it's an east wind. Look how specific that is. I would imagine this wasn't just sight, also sound. Sight and sound, audio and visual, in this great vision to Pharaoh. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears, and Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream, a vision. So this was while he was sleeping. Isn't it interesting, the cannibalization indicated? The lean cows cannibalizing the fat cows. The lean ears cannibalizing the healthy ears. And who ever heard of corn eating another ear of corn? See, it's outlandish, but God can do what he needs to do to make the point. It's outlandish, I guess. See some skinny cows eating up some fat cows, although I'm sure there's cannibal stuff going on in the animal kingdom. We know it is. They eat whatever's there. But ears of corn eating each other, well, that one's pretty much in the Walt Disney realm, isn't it? In the cartoon category. But look how vivid it is. But I think the idea of the cannibalizing is interesting, meaning the source of that attack will be from a wickedness from the east. They don't know a personal adversary yet, but boy, we do when we read it. And look how he indicated this to Pharaoh by revelation. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, yes, his heart, his mind. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt. See? Priests were divided into 4 classes, Bullinger writes, and 5 priests chosen from them were the king's counselors. Spiritualists, of course. Same outfit that Moses dealt with later. And all the wise men thereof, and Pharaoh told them his vision, dream, dream applies here. But there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Boy, oh boy, the situation is set up. Now I see I have a notation from Old Testament light. Let's see what we got here. Holy cow, look at the clock. No, I don't. Anyway, in biblical days, magicians, like wise men, were employed as counselors to kings and statesmen. Magic was regarded as a high profession, and magicians were highly honored by kings and princes. Same thing goes on today. They just don't call it that. But it's definitely spirits working in many of these counselors to the great heads of state today. That's my added comment. Okay, I don't know if this adds a lot. He refers to Moses and Aaron later. I think it's pretty obvious at this point. Let's see. Boy. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, verse 9, saying, I do remember my faults this day. See, he's a good Joe. He's a body-soul good Joe. He's aware that he made a mistake in his memory. So I like this guy. Yes, very human that he forgot. Very easy for humans to forget to whom they should be grateful and stay grateful, and for whom they should be grateful for accomplishments in their lives. Then spake the chief butler, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night. I and he, we dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream or vision. And there was there with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. Young would be anyone under 30. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our visions. To each man according to his vision, he did interpret. He repeated that. Man, he's amazed when he recalls it now. And it came to pass as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, referring to Pharaoh, and him he, the Pharaoh, hanged. Let's see. Now let's stop here a minute. Did Joseph's interpreting of those dreams cause the coming to pass of the butler being restored and the baker being executed? I'd say no. That was going to happen no matter what. But the point of the revelation was to make this impression on the mind of the butler that at the right time and place he would remember it. It would have made, to me, it would have made no difference whether Joseph interpreted their vision, whether they would have even had the vision. Did them even receiving the dream lead to their particular consequences or blessing? No. That was to set it up for Joseph to show his worth, show his caliber in revelation and spiritual matters, so that he could be called forth at the right time to save the bloodline, the Christ line. How do you like that? Because there's no cause and effect between the interpretation of the dream and Pharaoh's decision. There isn't. Let's be logical. So it had a greater profit that overwhelmed or I don't know, what am I after here, that stood above the actual events. Revelation in our lives will be that way at times too. It'll really have nothing to do with the cause and effect produced, but the profit will be a greater spiritual prevailing down the line. So I just thought of that. If I had any more brains, I'd think through some illustrations. Right now I can't pull them out of my hat. But I think that's a tremendous perspective. No cause and effect. You see how the logic of the word? There's no cause and effect between the visions, the interpretation of them, and Pharaoh's decisions to restore the butler and execute the baker. No cause and effect. And yet, the impact, the profit withal, was in the memory of the butler to bring Joseph before Pharaoh, and then God's works and will could really crank. Look at everything the Father does to get his will to come to pass without violating the free will of ignorant, stupid, even wicked people. He won't do it. He's the God of light, the God of love, the God of free will. And it requires faithfulness and specific requests at times, and the alacrity of our thought in our prayer lives, if we want to allow him to be unrestrained to go to work for and in our lives. A lot of lessons in there. So there he goes. Then Pharaoh sent, verse 14, and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily, made him run, it says, Bullinger says, out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came unto Pharaoh. Dr. Will always loved this. Look at the appreciation of protocol, the caliber of this young man. He didn't just go in there sloppy and stinky and acting like he owned the world like some hippie on acid. Look at the discipline of protocol, dressing properly. I think I told you the story once of how I wore a nice casual outfit to my son's baseball game and ended up having to umpire, and because the umpire didn't show up, and one of the corps commented on how I was dressed better than anyone out there to go out and present myself above all the parents and all the crowd and umpire the game. I thought that was sweet of her to recognize that. I was prepared, even though it was a no sense knowledge reason that I would think I'd be in front of all those people. I think I told that story, and so anyway, I just summed it up. I gave you the Cliff Note version. But look at this. Loved it. Dr. Rule always loved this. Bullinger has an interesting note. The beard was a disgrace in Egypt. Shaving, a disgrace in Palestine. See, so the Hebrew culture, you grew a beard as a young man. Remember, he was 17 on up to 30 here. Yes, later this will come up too. So it would have been a disgrace to appear before the Pharaoh, and that would have just worked against him. Protocol, very important in these situations in life, very important. You want people to listen to you, you got to adapt to the scenario, and that'll change with the situation. But it requires thinking and thought. All right, where are we? Shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. It's already set up for Joseph to be set head and shoulders above the spiritualists that were his counselors, these revered and honored men that were supposed to be spiritually tuned in. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. Elohim shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Boy, right away, that's, first of all, giving credit to Elohim, who they would recognize as the Hebrews' God by name, Elohim. And then he'll give you an answer of peace. That had to be revelation, because these dreams are very disturbing. The peace will be in the solutions that emerge in the further word of wisdom given to Joseph and how to protect them from what's coming. An answer of peace. Isn't that lovely? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, In my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river, And behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. See, if this was a movie, they'd just skip over all that, wouldn't they? The Word repeats in detail what we've already read. So I take that seriously. There's a reason Father had Moses to write this in such repeating what he had already told him. You know, you're watching a TV show, you go, I've already heard all that, let's move on. You don't do that with the Word. There's a reason all these details are repeated. I think it verifies the accuracy of Pharaoh's remembrance and recollection, sort of shows the caliber of man he was. And he was going to prove himself a great man, very rare in that situation. I like it. And behold, 7 other kind came up after them, poor and ill-favored, and lean flesh, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. There's an addition. His comment, I think that's an addition. Ill-favored and lean flesh. Yeah, I don't think he said that the first time. All right. You know, the way to look at this is the first time it's just explaining from God's point of view. Those that write books and novels talk about an omnipotent narrator telling you a story. He knows things that even the characters in the story don't know. But for the benefit of us readers, we appreciate it reading a story or a novel. There's omnipotent narrators, there's third-person narrators, there's first-person narrators, where a man is telling his own story, but his awareness is limited as the events unfold. This is an omnipotent narrator. The first time, it's God just telling us what he dreamed. This time, him recounting it is the first time he's actually saying it out loud. Or, no, he must have told his magicians. He sent and called for all his magicians of Egypt. See, you don't think all this every time you read it, or even the 40th time you read it. I'm just now thinking of this. And all the wise men there, and Pharaoh told them his vision. All right. Okay, he did tell them in verse 8. But the account from verses 1 to 7 is God's point of view telling us what the vision was. So he had told his guys, now he retells it from his point of view, retells it to Joseph, as he wants Joseph to get the details like he gave the other guys. So to me, that shows his quality. I like that. His humility. He didn't just say, okay, if you're so smart, tell me the dream and then tell me what it was. That later happened to the magicians under that guy in the book of Daniel. All right. Let's get back to this. See, I just wanted to get that straight in my thought. And the lean and the ill-favored kine did eat up the first 7 fat kine. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them. But they were still ill-favored as at the beginning. That's an addition. This is Scripture build-up. You couldn't recognize that they ate them because they were still all scrawny. Previous line, I never saw it in all the land of Egypt for badness. That's important. The Pharaoh's honest, impromptu remark in response to the vision. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them. But they were still ill-favored, as at the beginning. So I awoke, and I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 ears, withered, thin, and blasted. Again he recounts with the east wind. sprung up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. And I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. That's revelation. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. Well, we know the true God's going to do the 7 plenteous years, and the false God's going to do the famine years. God's warning him of the false God's actions. See, they again weren't aware of the accuser of the brethren. The 7 good kine are 7 years. Bullinger has quite a lengthy note on this, but let's keep moving. And the 7 good ears are 7 years. Boy, this number 7 is magnificently significant, isn't it? Spiritual perfection in abundance, spiritual perfection in the discerning information regarding the famine that's coming. Remember, discerning of spirits is the 7th manifestation listed in 1 Corinthians 12. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. What he did in the 7 abundant years, what he has to allow in the 7 years of famine. See, this makes sense. The adversary is attacking the Christ line. Also, it makes sense because Egypt is a completely pagan, devil spirit infested nation. So that's his access. That's his access because of the spirit infestation of the nation that rules the known world at the time. And there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt. That's what it means when the ill-favored kind weren't fattened up. And the famine shall consume the land. Let's see, consume the land. What's that mean? Well, it's a metonymy, meaning the people in the land. All right. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following. Repeats that. That explains the Pharaoh's admonition that the ill-favored, you couldn't even tell that they'd eaten up the fat ones. For it shall be very grievous. And for that the dream or vision was doubled unto Pharaoh twice, literally reading, and sent twice. It is because the thing is established by God, Elohim, and Elohim will shortly bring it to pass. They can pray all they want for the 7 famine years not to come, but it's established. They're coming. So no point in praying against the revelation. Pray that you have the strength to do what it takes to get ready for it. That would be more sense, wouldn't it? Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise. He goes further and set him over the land of Egypt. Look at this word of wisdom that he's inspired to utter forth, to give direction. Let Pharaoh do this. Take action, and let him appoint officers over the land. Look at the detail of the revelation. And take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. Why the 5th? Revelation. That's why the 5th. Later it became a decree to protect them from future famine that Joseph, by revelation, recommended to Pharaoh, and he agreed to it, that a 5th of the crop would be collected in Pharaoh's stores. Revelation. Why would you pick a 5th? Why not half? Why not less than that? God knows. He told Joseph. Joseph spoke it forth. No more, no less. 20%. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh. And let them keep food in the cities. See, it needs to be controlled. And that food shall be for store to the land. against the 7 years of famine. That's the purpose of it. Leave it alone till then, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not, meaning the people, through the famine, because the people that would perish would be the bloodline of Christ if this isn't carried out. You know, when he taught it, he also talked about what would you figure for rodent eating of what's stored. You're going to have to figure for a deterioration factor. So all of that would have been covered by taking a fifth, that there would be enough. Barely, but enough. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh. See, that shows he wasn't a wicked and evil possessed guy. And in the eyes of all his servants. They all backed him up. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the spirit of Elohim is? Well, to ask the question, the answer is obvious. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as Elohim has showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. What a magnificent recognition. Wow. I'd really love to think that this Pharaoh will be in the resurrection of the just. Wouldn't that be something? As a body, soul, Gentile man who allowed a man of Elohim to save the Christ line from extermination by following his direction and his guidance. And he does it throughout his life with Joseph. He never backs down. He never breaks his word. He never kicks Joseph out. He's more and more gracious. When Joseph gets to bring his family, his relatives, back into Egypt to live, he's more than accommodating the Pharaoh to take care of this man's family who has saved their entire civilization. He bends over backwards to welcome Joseph's father and his brethren. This is quite a guy. This is one of the few great unbelieving believers that I would like to see by God's mercy and grace is in the resurrection of the just, and that sort of, makes sense to me, doesn't it to you? Wow. Later, after Joseph dies, the word makes the point in Exodus that there arose a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph, meaning in a euphemistic way, he was the opposite of the loving and accommodating Pharaoh that recognized a man of God. The guy that followed, of course, was a man born of the devil's seed, caused great hardship and wickedness. He's the one Moses and Aaron had to deal with. Well, and thou shalt be over my house. Well, he's already proven that in Potiphar's house and in the prison, that he's the greatest steward that God could arise up for this responsibility. According to thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. Wow. Talk about a promotion from a household to a prison to second in command in the greatest nation on earth. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. Each of these are very significant acts of honor. In Lamsa's book, he has a wonderful expansion on the importance of jewelry in symbolism. Then again, rings were used as signets, S-I-G-N-E-T-S, signet ring, wherewith imperial edicts, secret documents, and treaties were sealed. The signet ring, I believe, is especially figuratively appropriate to speaking in tongues. Speaking in tongues is our signet ring on the promises of God, sealed, that it will come to pass as we energize our believing with Holy Spirit praise and prayer. And he made him to ride in the second chariot, which he had. And they cried before him, bow the knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. You know, there's again explanations on lifting up the hand and the foot. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt, meaning in dealing with the plenty and the famine coming, Joseph was the authority, and they were to follow his direction. And that becomes very important when the years of famine hit. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah. Okay, this name. In Aramaic, Lamsa says it means the interpreter of dreams or the revealer of hidden secrets. Bullinger's note is a little different, but I think it's beautiful too. It means abundance of life or food for the living. I think those two definitions could certainly coexist. Both be true. And he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar. Now Potiphar was his former master. Similar name. I wonder if it's a play on words. God's having a little fun here. I don't know. Asenath means she who is of Neith, an Egyptian goddess. Priest of On. So the father-in-law is a priest of this counterfeit god. But look how big the revelation is. Look how unique the situation is. In this category, godliness can reign supreme and prevail. Now, you just can't walk into any circumstance that's in your fancy to walk into and believe that the Spirit of God's going to cause His Word to live, even though you know it's a contaminated scenario. There has to be clear word of wisdom, word of knowledge, if that's going to work. And in many cases, as you know, they're not to have anything to do with these unbelieving, possessed peoples. In this case, it was of such a necessity, and Joseph was just big enough spiritually to pull it off. He was allowed. And he lived the rest of his life there. He lived I think he lived to 110, if I'm remembering. So he lived from the age of 30 to the age of 110, lived revered as a man of God, respected by the Pharaoh. So when God's revelation hits, boy, it stays hit as you continue to manifest believing to carry it out. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. That's the revelation. The food of the field, which was round about every city, laid he up in the same. Well, that's an added point, isn't it? And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, great figurative impression, very much, until he left or quit numbering, for it was without number. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, repeats all that to show you how God's revelation supersedes any contamination. Bear unto him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God said, He hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second called he Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And these are grow up to be 2 great men of God who receive the blessing of Jacob before he dies. And they're born of an Egyptian princess, daughter of a priestess. But Joseph's believing and love and spirituality supersedes any negatives that could have infected those wonderful men later in life. And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended. And the 7 years of dearth or famine began to come. Bullinger has a note, one of 13 famines. The number of betrayal, one of 13 famines the adversary manipulated. I read a book years ago, part of a book, where a man had done a study on all the modern famines in modern history. And his conclusion was, in every case, the reason the famines happened were human contrived. Politics and religion withholding from the common people the products and the food that was available. That was a sense knowledge historian came to that conclusion. Isn't that something? Not the crops failing, not weather. That might have come in the situation, but there was enough to feed the people, and politics and religion kept them from feeding and caused the great starvations of the terrible famines in modern history. Thought that was pretty cool. In this case, you had a rare occasion where the humans involved were doing the right things by following the revelation of this man of God. 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said, and the famine was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. Wow. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph. Look how that Pharaoh stood strong on what he initially said. What he saith to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses. And guess what? Dr. Will always did this. And gave away unto the Egyptians. And then he'd yell at the top of his lungs, No, no, no. And then he'd often say the giveaway programs of the United States over these decades has been the cause of more hatred, more animosity than anything else. He sold unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore into the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn. Buy corn. It wasn't free will handout, because that the famine was sore in all lands. And he went on to always tell us this is how God brought all the wealth of the world into Egypt. Later, when the children of Israel are led out of bondage by Moses, they took all that gold, all that silver, all those precious goods with them as payment for their enslavement for 400 years, wasn't it? And with all that, they were able to build the tabernacle and all its beautiful implements, and later perhaps even elements of it in use of building Solomon's temple. I'm not sure about that part of it, but God's purposes working in the heart. And see, all these great men and women of the Old Testament that we study, they all only had in part what Jesus Christ carried in full. If you look as we close here in John 3, at the end of the chapter, when John the Baptist is testifying to Jesus Christ, coming to take things over, verse 31, he that cometh from above, referring to his virgin conception, is above all. He that is of the earth is earthly, referring to himself, and speaketh of the earth. He that cometh from a heaven is above all, again referring to his supernatural birth. And what he hath seen and heard, that he witnesses to, testifieth, and no man receiveth his testimony. He that hath received his testimony hath set to his seal that God is true. For he whom God hath sent speaketh the words of God. Here it is. For God giveth not the Spirit by measure unto him. In other words, Jesus Christ, with his perfect body, soul, especially soul life, blood uncontaminated in his virgin conception, had the capacity to hold the fullness of that Spirit that was given at the time. So when I look at the Old Testament, as great a man as Joseph, he only had a portion of what Jesus Christ had. As great a man as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, as great a man as David, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, on and on, Amos. They only had portions of the gift of Spirit that Jesus Christ had in full. And today for us, it is Christ in us, the fullness of the head God bodily, Christ in us, the hope of glory. That's why these records are for our learning, not just intellectually, not just academically, but in the very depth of our heart and soul and mind and strength. We carry the capacity in our times, in our day, to have such an impact as these men we study. And I've often said, I believe the rising up of the remnant, what we know today as the remnant of the household of the grace of God, has already proven Joseph-like in our impact on saving our world from deep, dire catastrophe. And I think anyone with any sense can see that in events even that you are aware of, that I'm aware of, in the last even 20 or 30 years. The breakdown of the stock market crash in 2008 should have caused chaos, anarchy, murder in the streets. That's what the spirit realm wanted. That's what the sons of the devil that run this world wanted. The race reverberations that cropped up a few years ago with all the uncontained riots and everybody acted like these rioters were heroes for some damn reason, possessed as crazy, walking around killing and maiming, all their excuses, all their malarkey. That should have taken our nation down. And a little old remnant standing in the gap kept the devil from doing what he wanted to do, because we discomfit the swarms of spirits as locusts that attack. We stand faithful. We break them apart in component part, like Joseph broke apart the heinous designs of the prince of the power of the air against the seed of Christ developing in the tribe of Judah and those other great men and women of Israel that he wanted to live and stand for him. So I see the comparisons, and it's not just academic, it's not just intellectual, it's by the Spirit of God in us. What they had in part, our dunamis is in fullness, in wholeness, that we can do the same works as Jesus Christ, and greater, and greater. How big do you want to dream it? How big do you want to develop your honest, godly self-respect? The keys are in these records. I'm doing my best to point out many of them doctrinally and practically. So we'll continue with this into the so-called New Year. Many make New Year's resolutions. We make renewed mind resolutions every day. We make new nature resolutions, sometimes hour by hour, don't we? And this is how we must continue to stand faithful like a Joseph, to keep this word alive and to keep the catastrophes of the enemy's dreams and plans off the backs of good, wonderful people that want to live with discipline, like we see Joseph and his family eventually did. All right. God bless you. Thank you for joining me today. We'll get together again next Saturday. Bless your heart.